You're listening to Stimulus Tech Talk, a conversation-based podcast created by Stimulus Technologies that covers a range of topics related to business and technology.
Welcome to Stimulus Tech Talk. I'm Sherry Lipp, the marketing manager at Stimulus Technologies, and I am here as usual with Stimulus Technologies CEO Nathan Whittacre. And today we are going to be talking about AI in business, specifically for nonprofits. Welcome, Nathan.
Thanks, Sherry, and welcome everybody to the podcast today.
So we talk a lot about AI on here, and it's nice to sometimes dive into very specific uses because a lot of times we talk about generative AI, but there's lots of uses for it. So where do you see nonprofits using it the most?
Well, I think certain areas of nonprofit is AI could be very useful is in content generation. And I'm thinking specifically around grant funding. And, hopefully in this podcast, we could talk a little bit about, we're not a nonprofit ourselves, but we just went through a large grant process. And AI was very useful for us to effectively put in these grants and win the grants. So, yeah, I think, we think about AI in different areas and using it for research, using it to understand and summarize laws or RFPs or grant requests, things like that. I think AI could be a great research tool and also a content generation tool to save time for the nonprofits to maybe apply for more grants or be more effective on their grant writing process.
So in addition to nonprofits, what other do lots of different types of businesses apply for get grants? I know you just mentioned we did. What other businesses might apply for grants?
Well, there are grants available, for example, for employee training. So, potentially you want to upskill your staff. There's federal and state money available to do that, and depending on the state. And so you can write a grant request to have the government help you pay for specialized training or certifications for your employees. So that's a really good use of using AI to do grant writing and maybe research. It can do some research on what availability there is for those type of programs and help you write a proposal for it. We've actually done that at Stimulus also in the past and had really good luck with that. I think most businesses get really nervous about responding to RFPs, which are requests for proposals. And that's usually larger businesses or government agencies put out RFPs. And they can seem really onerous to a small business to be able to, to have to fill out sometimes, hundreds of pages of responses for these RFPs. There's a lot of questions that are repetitive. And so you can use AI to gather the information and help you draft effective responses to those RFPs. Also, to understand what the laws associated, if they are government grants or government projects, are associated, what responsibilities you have as an organization. So you may have had in the past hire out a third party to help you write these grants or hire, grant writers internally. And this you probably still have to have somebody to manage this, but they can do it more effectively and possibly apply for more either grants or respond to RFPs or l- research out what availability there is for these type of projects.
And before we dive a little further into approach and application, are there considerations that nonprofits need to make when using AI as a tool, as opposed to us or any other business?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that you have to consider is, making sure that you do still understand the regulations. As we've discussed in the podcast before, AI certainly can help you do research, but it's still on you to ensure that you understand, the requirements of, the grant or the RFP or, the project, that you're associated with. So you can't 100% rely on AI to do that effective research, and especially when you're talking about legal terms. So I would still highly recommend consulting with legal counsel and making sure that you have expertise surrounding it and not just assuming that AI is giving you 100% accurate information.
And do you find that is there any part of the cycle of the process where AI is has the most value, or do you find that you use it throughout the entire process?
What we did at Stimulus, we used it throughout the entire process, from understanding the guidelines of the grant all the way through content generation, and then understanding things like cure requests, or the legal aspects of it, doing research on that, and again, we read the core materials that came back in. But sometimes they become pretty daunting, and you have to refer back to them often. So having AI, keep that in memory of your interactions can help you produce and understand the content better, and they can keep, those different puzzle pieces that have to match correctly better together for you. And again, it helps you create a very good draft that you can then, use to produce your final proposal for the grant.
Could AI be used to find grant opportunities as nonprofits may be having to look for specific opportunities?
Yeah, so the research of, grant availability is a really good tool to use AI for. It can go out there and, find availabilities, and you can have it do deep research about, the availability of grants. If you have, if you're a nonprofit that specializes, in a specific type of service, have it, do research of proposals that are going through, if you're doing federal grants or Congress or state or local grants, potentially who the grant authority is, so you can get in contact with the agency, the federal agency or the local agency. So it can do a lot of research for you, so you can make those connections, understand what the availability is. So it's I think it's really important as you're going through this process to be very specific with AI, because it can pull random grants from any state or anywhere. You need to make sure that you, as you're doing the research on it, that you're very specific on the type of organization you are, the type of grants that you're looking for, and your geography. Then understand the requirements that might come up during that grant process. So you might potentially may not even be able to apply for the grant because of a geographic restriction or an organizational size restriction. So, still, read the grant requirements, and make sure you understand them so that you're applying for the right grants.
And we've been just saying using AI, but what tools might businesses or nonprofits be using for this?
You can use, there's several AI tools that are great. It would be one of the large language models. So you can use something like ChatGPT or Claude, Grok, or Microsoft Copilot. Those are the tools that a lot of people use. And there's different reasons why you'd want to use the different tools. For example, Microsoft Copilot integrates directly with Word. So, you can generate the content directly in a Word document, whereas the other tools aren't quite as effective at it. So one of the things I do recommend is trying all of them out, because they may do research differently, and you may get a little bit different results. So it's always good to use the same prompts in the different large language models to see what results you get, because they could do research differently.
And we've talked a lot about creating agents and various different things on here. Is that something that you did? Can you create agents that will help you with the different things that you have to do with grant funding?
Yeah, I think that's an important part of it. So if there's, a specific grant that you're working on, you could load the grant documents, if you get some PDFs around that, and create a specific agent. So as you're interacting with it, it already has that content and the details available to it. You might also, specify organizational information so that it has that in memory. And, because a lot of grants, some of the requests on there is, organization information, biographies of individuals, resumes, background information, potentially financials, which you want to make sure that you have a secure model if you're going to share any of that. So, putting that information into a specific bot that you create means that you don't have to constantly go back and re-input that information in. It's all readily available in that model.
How did you approach training, your agents and prompting? Because we all know that when you ask AI a question, it answers. it tries to give you the answer. It seems like it tries to give you an answer that you're looking for. How do you know that it's giving you accurate information and not just making something up as far as like numbers and results and stuff like that?
You have to verify, that's what I've said a few times on here is, just because you're using AI to assist, it's really important that you do understand the request. And if there's any questions, if there's, specific responses that you have, go back and read the source materials. So, our project was mostly funded and governed by 2 CFR 200, which is federal guidelines, federal rules. And the number of times that I went back and actually read the specific rule through the whole process to understand it was really important. And then there was, each state had their own guidelines, and we went back through, read many paragraphs, so that we understood the process. And so if AI, again, hallucinates or makes up information, we understood the background and could correct it easily. So I think it's really important, even if you're using AI to assist, you need to have a grant expert that's using it. And we had with our grant, we had a team that was working on this, which included some attorneys to guide us through the process. So it wasn't blind trust in the AI. And it's interesting. The few of our peers in the industries just had kind of blind trust in using AI. And I think they're going to get themselves into trouble if they were awarded the grants from a compliance standpoint, because they might not understand the rules and regulations that they have to comply with down the road. Because applying for the grant is one thing, and then actually doing the work is a completely different thing. And then complying with the rules, you need to make sure that you understand the obligations you're getting yourself in with these grants. It's not just free unlimited money from the government or organizations. It comes with a lot of, as any nonprofit knows, there's a lot of strings attached. And so it's really important that the organization understands what those strings are and legally could follow them if they are awarded the grant.
AI hallucination was, I heard that term for the first time when I was actually getting this podcast ready. Is that a term that's come about?
Yeah, it's a pretty common term now. So, some of the things that AI does is, it'll make things up. I learned early on as I was putting together a presentation, I was using AI to do some research, and I asked it to generate, a number of quotes, from research, like Simon Sinek. What did Simon Sinek say about something, and about, leadership? And generated a quote, and then I asked it for the source of it, because I wanted to make sure that I sourced it correctly. I said, well, there's really no source. This is the essence of something Simon Sinek would say, and there's a hallucination. It just created something out of nowhere, and it hallucinated. The other thing that it will do, AI wants to be friendly and helpful and make you feel good, and it will tell you what you want to hear. So it's also important to ask AI to validate the information, and also ask it to, what's the contrary argument to what it's telling you. Ask it to argue with itself, and it'll also do that. You certainly don't want to it always agreeing with your question or agreeing with your response, because it will just agree with you and tell you you're awesome and amazing, and it'll make you feel good. So
Yep. You have to look, and then when you point out where it was wrong, it gets very apologetic.
it's pretty
Um,
funny.
so when it comes to budget, how did you budgeting for grants find AI to be a useful tool, and then where does the human component come into that?
Yeah, so some of the things we used AI for in our grant is understanding, the number of employees required to fulfill the grant requirements. We asked it to do some research on that and compile numbers. So we asked it to do calculations. This was, a fiber grant project, so fiber optic builds. Probably a little bit different than a nonprofit would generally apply for, but there's obviously people involved with grant fulfillment. So we said, we had X size of project, so many miles of fiber to build over a certain period of time, have it estimate, the number of crews, and then, the cost for that to deploy the fiber. And, it came up with actually relatively accurate numbers once we fine-tuned information. So that was an interesting part, is it was able to do some of those calculations. We never there was a portion of it that had to be engineered, and so we relied on engineering numbers, and actual engineers to do the work. But what was interesting is, like, for our initial design of the network, we used a specific AI tool to produce a route for the project that was probably 90% accurate. And then that was the basis for the engineers to go in there and verify the routing and then put their, professional engineer stamp on it. So I think you'll hear my theme over and over again in this conversation is AI is a tool to get kind of like a baseline, get you started, and then have the professionals come in and ensure the information's correct, and then make any adjustments that are necessary. So AI gets you maybe 80%, 90% there, and then the experts come in and get you the rest of the way and ensure the information is accurate.
Yeah, I was gonna say, could you have AI like spit out like a full grant proposal? And I know you kind of touched on this a second ago. Could that hurt your chances of getting funded if it looks like you just submitted a completely AI written proposal?
I think it would, but maybe not completely. But I think the issue, whether you're funded or not, is can you fulfill the compliance side of it? Because what's going to happen is, if you tell the grant, whatever organization is, providing the grant, the administrators are going to say, well, in this grant proposal, you said you were going to do X. Why are you not doing that? And if you don't know what your grant proposal is binding you to, it could be a major problem in the future for you. So, don't obligate yourself on something that AI generated, because you're going to have to fulfill it. So, AI might say, well, we're going to send employees out there that are superhumans with 4 arms to do this project. And if you don't do that, then, you're going to have a problem. So you need to make sure that you're willing and able to comply with all the grant requirements, because, the AI is not going to do it for you. If you have to, service your clients, provide, a community service, it's really important that you have the expertise and capability of actually doing the work, once you receive that grant.
And kind of putting it all together, how there's probably different people in the organization doing different parts of this. How do you put it all together? Are they using different tools? Are they using the same tool? How does it come together?
So what we did, which was really effective, is we had dedicated SharePoint site for the different projects. Now, why we used AI for our grant project is we actually had, ended up being over 100 submittals that we had to do, and for each one of these, there were several hundred questions that we had to respond to. Some of them were just, putting in dollar figures. A large number of them had multi-page documents that we had to write, how we were going to, respond or operate or comply with different regulations. A lot of them were, our history and background and our capabilities. So we had to organize ourselves, and we used SharePoint to do that so that we could all be working on the same documents at the same time and collaborate with it effectively. The other thing is in SharePoint, you can create shareable document libraries that, we were using it to, check off, items that were done and assign those out. So, we'd say, Nathan, I'm responsible for these 5 items. And then I could go in there and filter it out and then mark it done or move it on to the next person. And it was really great from a collaboration standpoint to set up these SharePoint portals that we would all collaborate on and know where we're at, and putting these together. Because, one of the things about grants is, you're often, the grants released, and you might have 30 days to respond to it. Obviously everybody has the same period to respond to the grant request. You have to move in a timely fashion. And so keeping yourself really well organized is important, especially if you're applying for multiple of these. So, having one central place to store all the information and one central knowledge base on what's done was really helpful from a project management standpoint.
And how much time do you think using AI as a tool saved?
Probably thousands of hours in the end. So, some of the, we'd get on these calls, and, again, a lot of these, we were trying to respond to questions and do research. And I turned the team into a believer of AI as we were going through this over the last year and a half, because, the attorneys were used to drafting things from scratch. And I said, let me take a stab at it. And a lot of times my little content that I would, post in the Teams chat, they would say, "That's actually really good. There's just like one tweak that I would want to make here or there." But, drafting something, you have a little bit of a writer's block often, when you're trying to draft something from scratch. So if you have a basis to go off of and then you can modify it, to your organization or your voice, it helps a lot to have that basis. And so in the end, using, automation tools like SharePoint, having, organization, and then using AI to do a lot of the research and content generation. Um, I would say, if not hundreds, potentially over 1,000 hours of time over the course of 2 years, and we're still using it. I actually just this morning, just there was a question I had, and I still have my all my chats there for all the content. I had a question on a rule, and I asked it the question and asked it for the reference so I could look it up. If I didn't do that, I'd have to go to 2 CFR 200, search through there, hopefully find the regulation. But you know, AI saved me probably a 10-minute research project and got me the regulation and got me the answer that I needed quickly, and that was really effective.
And to wrap it up, if a nonprofit is just kind of jumping into starting to use AI in their organization, for grant funding, how do you help? How do we help them get started with that?
So we have a mastermind group that we offer for our customers, our clients. That if you're interested in this, we help clients collaborate with each other, and also with our team of experts on AI to understand what they can use AI for. And it's a mastermind group, so we collaborate with each other. That's a great way to start. And the other thing is we can help you set up those SharePoint sites so you can have all your data stored in the right location, creating the right security mechanism around it and ensure that, your data is protected as you're using AI to go through these processes. So we won't write the grants for you, but we will certainly help you get the infrastructure necessary to assist you through the process.
All right. Well, thanks, Nathan, and thanks everybody for listening. Let us know if you need help with this, and please like this video if you're watching on YouTube, and leave us a comment and let us know what you thought. Thanks, Nathan.
Thanks, Sherry, and thanks everybody for joining us.